The first time my mother ever saw a computer was 22 years ago when she visited my first apartment in 1997. And as the computer was booting up, she asked, "Now, is this the internet?" I laughed and told her, "No, the computer's still starting up." But, she asked a legitimate question. She didn't know computers took a while to turn on. She figured it was like a light switch or a radio or a television. You hit the power button and bam, there's the internet. It was a rational mistake. But there's a lot more to reaching the internet than simply turning on your computer. So, before I explain how you get the internet on your computer, you need to understand a little history about the process of getting computers to share information. So the first computers were invented in the 1940s, but they were usually used for specialized research or military purposes. And it wasn't until the 1950s, 1960s that computers found their way into more widespread public use in businesses and universities. So when these more user-friendly computers were first built, they consisted of terminals and mainframes. Mainframes were huge computer systems that would literally fill an entire room. The mainframe didn't have a monitor or a keyboard or anything. It was just the computer itself. So in order to get information in or out of the mainframe, you would use a smaller computer called a terminal. The terminal was just a monitor and a keyboard and a small bit of circuits to get it running and wired up to the mainframe. So, for example, you might have a science lab with multiple employees, and each one of them might have a terminal in their office, which are all connected to the same mainframe on some other floor in the building. So, as computers evolved, they became vastly more powerful and vastly smaller. The computational power you have in a smartphone today is greater than any mainframe had 50 years ago. As computers shrunk in size, they became the small self-contained devices we know today. So the reason home computers are called desktop computers is because they were finally able to fit on a desk instead of taking up an entire room. Now this was great because the computer was physically so much more manageable, but there was one obvious disadvantage to desktop computers. You couldn't share files and information anymore. The great thing about mainframes and terminals was that everyone at a terminal could access the same information on the mainframe. That made it very easy to collaborate on projects because all the scientists are working on the same files. But once the shared mainframe were replaced by personal computers on desktops, there's no way to access a centralized repository of data anymore. That was when networking was invented. Simply put, networking allowed one desktop computer to send and receive information with another desktop computer. It was kind of like teaching computers to make phone calls to each other. Thanks to networking, instead of being sequestered standalone machines, personal computers could now exchange information back and forth. So at first, computer networking was applied to all the computers in a single physical location. For example, all the computers at a college campus would be networked, or all the computers in an office building could be networked. But the idea grew even bigger. What if your college had multiple campuses around the city, or your business had multiple offices around the country? Could you network all of those computers to each other? And what if some of these networks didn't remain private? What if they became public, and people outside of your network could access information in your network? When this idea of networked computers began to spread, it was called the World Wide Web, because that is exactly what it was, a web of computers all interconnected around the world. Although, more accurately, the World Wide Web was a reference to the interwoven connection of documents which were stored on the computers. But today, there are multiple synonyms for the World Wide Web. The most common words people use are online, internet, web. All of these sentences mean the same thing. I'm going online. Look it up on the internet. I found it on the web. Now, computer nerds, they'll have a conniption when they see that, okay? Because they will argue that the World Wide Web and the internet are not the same thing. And I'm stupid and I'm an idiot, and if I knew anything about computers, I wouldn't be telling people that. Well, to heck with those nerds, okay? While in the most technical sense, the World Wide Web and the internet are different things, the differences are irrelevant in a video teaching the basics of computers. For most intents and purposes, the World Wide Web and the internet are interchangeable. And who are you? What label are you given as a person looking at a website? Well, in internet terminology, a person viewing a website is typically called a user or a visitor. At Walt Disney Studios, we called our visitors guests. And I still tend to use that term because it just sounds more respectful. Building a website for a customer or a user is fine, but building a website for a guest is more meaningful. So how does the internet work? Well, in the most simplistic terms, the internet allows you to connect your personal computer over a global network of other computers to access information. Obviously, this means there are electronic signals traveling in two directions, from your computer out to the internet, and from the internet back to your computer. In order to send and receive those signals, your computer will need new hardware and software. The hardware is called a modem, and the software is called a web browser, or just a browser for short. So let's start with the hardware. Gaining access to the internet is a lot like gaining access to a cable television service or a cell phone provider. There are monthly fees involved and many options and choices and different types of modem technology. There are DSL modems you can get from a local telephone company, which will physically plug into a phone jack in your house, then into your computer. There are cable modems you can get from a cable television provider, which will physically plug into your cable television wire, then into your computer. There are wireless 4G modems you can get from a cell phone provider, which might not have any wires at all. I can't cover all the modem options in this video. Just know you'll need some type of modem hooked up to your computer before you can access the internet. You could maybe even get a satellite modem. Anyway, the companies that provide this service are called Internet Service Providers, or an ISP. Now, typically, speed is the biggest variable in the cost. So what do I mean by speed? Well, as you send and receive data to and from your computer, called downloading when you're receiving and uploading when you're sending, the electronic signals can only move so fast over different services. The faster the service, the more it will cost. The speeds of data transfer are measured in units called megabits, not to be confused with megabytes of storage on your hard drive, okay? The Y and the I get a little tricky. So obviously, the more megabits per second, abbreviated as Mbps, an ISP will guarantee, the more expensive their monthly service fees will be. Now you want to have at least 6 megabits per second as your guaranteed download speed. Anything slower and you really can't watch video with good quality. Video requires a transfer of massive amounts of data in very short periods of time. So, you follow all that so far? I apologize if I'm moving a little quickly on this. It's just, I know there's a lot to take in. So let's summarize what we have so far, okay? You need to get a modem from an ISP. The monthly cost of using the modem will be more expensive depending on the speed of the service. Once your modem is hooked up and properly configured, you need to use a new software program called a web browser. Now, most computers will always have a web browser included with the basic operating system. Older versions of Microsoft Windows include a browser called Internet Explorer. Newer versions of Windows include a browser called Edge. Most Macintosh computers use a browser called Safari. I prefer to use a browser called Chromium, which is the basis for a very popular browser called Chrome, made by Google. Other popular browsers are Firefox, and Opera. Now, no matter which browser you use, they all function in a similar way. The browser window is just a blank screen until you type the address of a website into the text field at the top of the browser. A website address is also called a domain name, or a URL, which stands for Universal Resource Locator. So remember, all three of those terms are interchangeable and they mean the same thing. Web address, domain name, URL. Okay? Now, website addresses typically have the prefix www and the suffix .com. www stands for World Wide Web, and .com stands for commercial. Now, there are many other suffixes for domain names. .gov is for government sites. .edu is for educational sites like universities. .net is for any kind of network, and .org is for any kind of organization. So, www.com websites are intended to be commercial websites on the World Wide Web. Now today, the .com suffix has kind of lost the original meaning. You see, the problem is when the internet first began, .com became so popular, everyone just kept using .com for all sorts of websites, including those that just weren't commercial in nature. That's why almost every website you see today is a .com site. The word was so unusual and memorable, it became the default term for websites and internet companies in general. When someone says they work at a .com, that means they work in the internet industry, even if their company might have a .org web address. For example, this website, Girls and Grandpas, the address is www.girlsandgrandpas.com. Technically, it could probably be girlsandgrandpas.org, but I know that nobody would remember that. So it's girlsandgrandpas.com. So once you enter the URL of the website, you click on the Go button or hit the Enter key on your keyboard, and within a couple seconds, that website should appear in your browser. When a browser displays a web page on your monitor, that process is called loading or rendering the page. So if you have a slow internet connection, you might say, this page is taking a long time to render, or this page is taking forever to load. That's just another way of saying, hey, nothing's showing up. So think of a website as a pamphlet with different pages of information. The whole pamphlet is called a website, and the individual pages are called web pages. As you move from one web page to the next, new data is sent to your browser, so you can see that page. So how does this work? What exactly is happening when you access the internet or visit a website? There are three primary types of computers which comprise the internet. First, there are personal computers, like yours. Second, are domain name servers, or DNS computers. And third, are web hosting computers, also called web servers. So the web servers are located all around the world in buildings commonly called server farms or data centers. And on their hard drives are the actual files that create a website. In essence, web servers function in a very similar way to old mainframes, and your home computer acts like a terminal, accessing the data. The DNS computers are located at your ISP, and they are electronic traffic controllers. They route the signals from your personal computer out to the web servers, and from the web servers back to your personal computer. Now, I'm simplifying the process. There's a lot more technical stuff happening, but as a broad overview, that's all you really need to know. So it's from you to the DNS computer at your ISP, to the data center web server, back to you, okay? So let's summarize this lesson. The web, or the internet, is nothing but a gigantic global network of interconnected computers sharing information. You need hardware called a modem and software called a browser to access the internet. To acquire a modem, you purchase a monthly service plan from an ISP, and the cost of that plan will vary depending upon the technology and the speed that ISP provides. When you type a web address into the URL field of your browser, it sends a DNS lookup request to your ISP, and your ISP sends that request to the specific web server containing that website. The web server, which contains that website, responds by transmitting files to your computer, which are rendered in your browser. So, I know this lesson contained a vast amount of information and new words and terminology. If you didn't understand right away or it's hard to follow, just be patient with yourself and go over it again. You need to understand these basic concepts of how the internet functions in order to understand the process of purchasing and creating a website. Without the basic knowledge of what you are buying or how it works, you'll be completely lost when I explain how to set things up. You'll catch on. Don't worry, this isn't very complicated. There's just a lot of new terminology. Remember, kids, the world owes you nothing until you create things of value.